The issue of sectarianism is very important because you're seeing sectarian tensions really bubble up into violent conflict in several countries in the region. We also have regarded it as important for further in-depth study because it's often simplified. It's often seen as a very simple thing that Sunni and Shia are fighting each other because they have different interpretations of Islam. But a look at history and a look at the variety of the countries in the Muslim world shows that that's simply not the case. There is no eternal conflict here, but sometimes these different religious identities can become caught up in wider political and economic disputes.
The future trend of sectarianism is quite an important issue to be confronted head-on. We must acknowledge that there is a fundamental failure of the state structures across the Middle East. Governments after governments have failed their people. They lost their legitimacy through corruption, nepotism, wars, dictatorships, and denial of basic rights. People have resorted back to their identities as a way of expressing their desire to gain status, to gain resources, to be part of power of the governments and the communities. It depends on very much how the state and the governments of the region will evolve. One thing for sure, sectarianism has been a latent reality of our part of the world, has been part of the social and cultural discourse, but its political use is very much part of the struggle over the future of this part of the world, is very much part of the regional dynamics as is struggling for redefining a new regional order.
We're certainly in a very dire situation right now in the Middle East. I mean, much of this is about the breakdown of states in the region. I mean, Syria, Iraq, when you have the breakdown of governments and institutions, people gravitate to their sect or their clan or their tribe. And then, of course, what we're seeing is very violent manifestations. And I think the ripples of that will echo for generations, unfortunately. But we know, I think it's human nature that when parties can find a common economic interest, they tend to minimize their differences. And so I'm hopeful that in the reconstruction process, these Shia-Sunni differences that we tend to think of as being medieval or primeval or going back centuries, that these differences can be overcome. And I found examples of that in isolated examples, but places where there was a common economic interest, there was intermarriage, and people tend to forget those differences when they're bound by economic necessity.
I think people sometimes get distracted by the religious paraphernalia that is associated with sects, and hence they go into the 1,400-year history of Islamic thought and what have you. I think it's much more the case that it's temporal political issues that are at stake related to the nation state and the division of political and economic resources within the nation state, and also to geopolitical rivalries within the region. And as I said, the parallels are plenty and are obvious, and they could be, as I said, on ethnicity or on region or on what have you. Unfortunately, since 2003, I'd say, and building on an earlier cumulative process, but since 2003, the sectarian prism has become politically relevant. It has gained an ability to inhere upon political perceptions, social perceptions, and geopolitical strategy.
Sectarianism is instrumentalized by political elites and used to mobilize militias and community responses. So there's many interweaving factors that are both local based and then regional. So the Syrian civil war and the spillover and the instability within the Middle East and conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia over regional hegemony is fueling sectarian tensions within Tripoli and also wider Syria and Iraq.
You get some officials that say, oh, these are troubles that have been happening for 1,400 years ago and we can't do it. Because that's wrong. That's factually wrong, actually. And in addition to that, it's not good enough to say there's nothing we can do about it, because of course there's something that each one of us can do. And I think for policymakers, especially in the Western world, it's all too often that what is said is in sectarian language, and that actually feeds into this cycle of sectarianism. So that can't be accepted. And I think what policymakers have to take it upon themselves is to say, we're going to dig deeper and actually deal with the political, societal, economic dynamics that are happening, and not simply brush it off as saying, well, it's always been this way, it always will be, because it hasn't always been this way, and it doesn't need to always be that way.
One of the recommendations that's repeatedly coming through for Westerners is to avoid seeing the region purely through a sectarian lens, and to avoid policies that will be seen as taking sides with one religious community or another. There's a concern that this can become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy if people see the region as defined entirely by sect, that makes it a more and more important division.